Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back from this hatchway. Civilians are not permitted on the bridge during an active blockade operation. Those are standing orders. I don't care who escorted you up here." The petty officer's voice was steady. He was proud of that. 22 years old, 8 months into his first deployment, standing watch on the bridge of a United States Navy destroyer in the Strait of Hormuz, with 9 Iranian fast boats on the threat board and a general quarters alert cycling through the ship's speakers every 40 minutes. And his voice was steady. He had planted himself in the hatchway with both feet, shoulders square, chin level, the way the instruction manuals said a man in authority was supposed to stand. He was not a large man, but he filled the doorway the way a new knife fills a sheath, precisely, intentionally, with nothing to spare. The woman looked at him without expression. She was small. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Small in the way that certain things in nature are small, the way a glass vial of something lethal is small, the way the eye of a storm is small, from 30,000 feet. She stood perhaps 5 feet 4 in the corridor outside the bridge hatchway, and she wore no uniform. Civilian clothes, dark slacks, a pale blue collared shirt, a carry-on bag slung from one shoulder. Her hair was silver, cut short and practical, and her eyes were the particular shade of gray-blue that the North Atlantic turns in October. Not cold exactly, but carrying the memory of cold, and the certainty that cold will come again. She had not spoken yet. Petty Officer Second Class Daniel Reyes had taken her silence as hesitation. It was not hesitation. Behind him, the bridge was operating at the compressed, quiet intensity of a crew that knows it may be tested before the next watch rotation. The watch officer, Lieutenant Commander Ferris, had his eyes on the surface radar. The combat systems officer was on the intercom with Combat Information Center. 3 junior sailors at their stations kept their eyes precisely forward, the way junior sailors do when something is happening that they have not been told how to categorize. The morning light through the bridge windows was pale and flat, the sun not yet fully up over the Omani coast, the strait below them still dark and silver and enormous. The junior sailor who had escorted the woman up from the quarterdeck stood 2 steps behind her in the corridor. His name was Seaman Collier. He was 18 months in service, and at this particular moment, he was experiencing the specific, unpleasant sensation of a person who has done exactly what they were told to do and is suddenly, deeply uncertain whether what they were told to do was correct. He had been directed by the quarterdeck duty officer to escort a civilian observer to the bridge. He had done that. He had led her through 2 watertight doors and up a ladder well and down the passageway that smelled of paint and salt water and electronics, and now Petty Officer Reyes was blocking the hatchway with his shoulders and his steadiness and his standing orders, and the woman was looking at Reyes with those gray-blue eyes, and something in Collier's stomach was quietly tightening. Here is what Seaman Collier did not know, because no one had told him, because the information existed in a classified annex attached to the operations order that governed this deployment, and that annex had been pinned to the mission board behind Petty Officer Reyes's left shoulder for 11 days. Here is what Petty Officer Reyes did not know, because his security clearance did not extend to that annex, and because when his watch supervisor had briefed him on standing orders for bridge access during blockade operations, neither man had thought to look at the name printed in the upper right corner of the document, currently 2 feet from Reyes's head. Here is what the watch officer, Lieutenant Commander Ferris, did not know, because he was watching 9 contacts on a surface radar in the Strait of Hormuz, and the geometry of those contacts was not friendly, and because the message traffic that had preceded this woman's arrival had been routed through the ship's intelligence officer and not through the deck log and not through the watch officer brief at 0400. And here is what the woman herself had not said, because she did not say things until they needed to be said, and this moment had not yet become the moment when they needed to be said. She reached for the door handle. Petty Officer Reyes reached out and closed his hand around her forearm. He pulled her back. The assembled watch crew saw it. In the silence that followed, the only sounds were the hum of electronics, the low percussion of the ship's engines far below, and the quiet, continuous voice of the surface search radar operator calling contacts in combat. The corridor light was fluorescent and exact. The woman stood in it without moving, her arm at her side where Reyes had released it, her carry-on bag still on her shoulder, her expression unchanged in any way that anyone present could have described with certainty. Reyes stood in the hatchway. His voice, when it came, was louder than before. He had mistaken the silence for uncertainty. He had mistaken her stillness for submission. These were two errors of a kind that under different circumstances might simply have been corrected and forgotten. Under these circumstances, they would be corrected in a manner that no one on that bridge would forget for the remainder of their careers. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that I am not asking. This is a warship conducting an active blockade operation. There are 9 Iranian surface contacts on our threat board. The bridge is restricted. You will step back from this hatchway and you will wait in the passageway until the duty officer can arrange a proper escort to an authorized observation area. Do I make myself clear?" The words fell into the corridor like objects dropped from a height, heavy, precise, final, in the way that a 22-year-old man's pronouncements feel final to a 22-year-old man. The woman's expression did not change. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked past him, through the open hatchway, at the bridge, at the mission board on the port bulkhead, at the classified annex pinned to that board in the upper right corner, and at the name printed there, visible from this distance if you were standing close enough, if you knew where to look, if you had, for example, written the annex yourself in the spring of 2019 while serving as Commander, Naval Forces Central Command, and later revised it twice, and knew the format because you had established the format. She looked back at Petty Officer Reyes. She said, quietly, "Is your executive officer on the bridge?" Reyes had prepared himself for argument. He had prepared himself for outrage, for the escalating insistence of a civilian who believed their access pass entitled them to spaces it did not entitle them to, and he had rehearsed, without quite knowing he was rehearsing, the measured, firm, courteous responses that would diffuse the situation while maintaining the order he was there to maintain. He had not prepared himself for that question, asked in that voice, in that tone, which was not pleading and not threatening and not anything he had heard before from a civilian standing in a corridor of a warship during a general quarters cycle, and which carried in it something he could not quite locate, like a frequency too low to hear but not too low to feel. "And the count is still rising," he said. "The XO is not currently on the bridge, ma'am." She nodded once. She set her carry-on bag on the deck of the corridor, with the particular care of someone who has learned not to waste motion on anything. She stood. She waited. She did not look at Reyes again. She waited the way someone waits when they are certain of what is coming, and when it is coming, and are simply allowing time to perform its function. 47 seconds later, the sound of boots on the ladder well echoed up from below. Commander Theodore Ashworth, executive officer of the USS Russell, came through the watertight door at the aft end of the passageway at the kind of pace that a man uses when he has been pulled away from something urgent by something he has been told is even more urgent. He was 43 years old, 19 years in the United States Navy, the son of a surface warfare officer, a graduate of the Naval War College, a man who had been in difficult situations, in difficult places, and had handled them with the controlled competence that the Navy selects for and cultivates over decades. He was not a man who went pale easily. He went pale. He stopped. For a moment that lasted less time than it felt like it lasted, he stood in the corridor looking at the woman standing outside the bridge hatchway with her carry-on bag at her feet, and the color left his face in the specific way that color leaves the face of a person who has just performed a mental calculation and arrived at a result they find catastrophic. He said, "Admiral." The word arrived in the corridor like a stone dropped into still water. Petty Officer Reyes heard it. He heard the precise formality of it, the specific military weight of it, 2 syllables carrying the entire architecture of a chain of command that extended from this passageway through Fleet Forces Command to the Secretary of the Navy and beyond. He heard it, and his body understood it before his mind did, because his body had been trained to respond to certain sounds the way a compass responds to north, and that word, spoken in that voice, was one of them. He turned. Commander Ashworth was already moving past him. He stopped beside the woman and came to attention, and his attention was not the casual acknowledgement of an equal or a superior. It was the full, precise, formal attention of a United States Navy commander in the presence of flag rank, spine straight, eyes forward, chin level, motionless as a photograph of himself. "Admiral," he said again, "we were not informed of your time of arrival. I apologize. Please, come in." The woman picked up her carry-on bag. She stepped through the hatchway onto the bridge. Commander Ashworth followed. He turned to the watch crew. His voice, when he spoke, had a quality that Seaman Collier would remember and describe 15 years later to a class of ensigns he would be instructing, as the quietest, loud voice he had ever heard. "Attention on deck." Every officer and enlisted sailor on the bridge of the USS Russell came to attention. Petty Officer Second Class Daniel Reyes stood in the bridge hatchway with the fluorescent light of the corridor at his back, and the pale morning light of the strait at his front, and 9 Iranian fast boats on the threat board 15 feet away, and the entire watch crew of his ship at attention, and he became aware of something. He became aware of the mission board on the port bulkhead, the one with the operations order attached to it, the one with the classified annex in the upper right corner. Commander Ashworth's voice was precise and even and very quiet. "Petty Officer Reyes, read me the author line of the classified annex, upper right corner, attached to the operations order." Reyes crossed the bridge in the silence of a room where every person is holding perfectly still. He stopped in front of the mission board. He looked at the annex. He looked at the upper right corner. He found the author line, 3 lines above the classification banner, printed in the standard administrative format that had been in use across the Navy for decades. He read it. He read it again. His mouth opened and then closed. Commander Ashworth said, "Out loud, Petty Officer." Reyes read it out loud. He read it slowly, the way a person reads something when the act of reading it is the act of understanding it, and understanding it is the act of recognizing what you have done, and what you have done is something you cannot undo. He read, "Vice Admiral Margaret Claire Holt, USN, retired." He read, "Former Commander, Naval Forces Central Command." He read, "Former Director, Naval Warfare Integration Group." He stopped reading because those were the only 2 lines, and he had read both of them, and the room was absolutely silent, and the woman was standing 4 feet away with her carry-on bag at her feet and her gray-blue eyes on nothing in particular, the way the eyes of a person go when they are not looking at anything in the room because they are already thinking about something 3 steps ahead. Petty Officer Reyes turned from the board. He turned to face her. He stood for a moment in which time did not seem to move at its customary rate. He said, "Admiral Holt." The words came out as a statement. They had arrived as a question, somewhere in the back of his mind, and by the time they reached his mouth, they had transformed themselves into the particular kind of statement that a person makes when they are simply confirming something they do not yet quite believe, though they know they must believe it, because it is written down, right there, on the board, in the format that doesn't lie. Commander Ashworth said, "Admiral Holt is here at the request of Fifth Fleet. She is observing the live application of the Hormuz escort doctrine under the renewed blockade. She will be on the bridge for the remainder of this watch, and as long thereafter as she deems appropriate." He paused. "The Hormuz escort doctrine, Petty Officer? Do you know who wrote it?" Reyes did not answer. There was no version of answering that would have helped him. If stories like this mean something to you, if they remind you of the quiet professionals who build the systems that hold the line, you can help keep them coming on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Ashworth turned to the Admiral. Admiral Holt had not yet spoken beyond those first 7 words in the corridor. She looked at the surface radar. She looked at the threat board. She looked at the 9 tracks that Combat Information Center was updating every 40 seconds. She set her carry-on bag down more permanently than she had set it down in the corridor, the way you set something down when you plan to be in a place for a while. She looked at Lieutenant Commander Ferris. She said, "What is the current bearing and speed on Contact Alpha 7? Ferris gave her the numbers without hesitation. When flag rank speaks on your bridge in that tone, numbers come out. She said, "And what is the assigned response package for fast boat swarm contact exceeding 8 units inside the 12-mile limit?" Ferris glanced at the operations board. The silence that followed was not a comfortable silence. She said, "Fast boat intercept drill, Section 3, page 42 of the doctrine. Have you run it?" The watch officer's eyes moved to Commander Ashworth. Ashworth said, "No, ma'am, it has not been incorporated into the current training cycle." She said nothing for a moment. She looked back at the radar, at Contact Alpha 7 and the 8 contacts around it, scattered across the threat board like seeds dropped by someone who was not concerned with aesthetics. She said, "I see." 2 words. 2 words, and the entire bridge crew felt them land in the way you feel something land when it is not loud, but it is heavy, when the quiet of it is itself a kind of emphasis, when a person who has the authority to say many things chooses to say only 2 of them, and the 2 they choose are, "I see." Petty Officer Reyes stood in his place at the bridge hatchway. He stood with the posture he had planted himself in 11 minutes ago, the shoulders square, the chin level, the feet placed with the precision of a man who intends to be taken seriously, and he discovered that posture, by itself, means very little. He stood in the hatchway of the bridge of a warship in the Strait of Hormuz, with his hand still carrying the physical memory of a retired vice admiral's forearm, and he understood, with the crystalline clarity that arrives only when error has made itself completely, finally, undeniably visible, what he had done. He had grabbed the arm of the woman who wrote the doctrine the ship was currently executing. He had pulled her back from the door of the bridge she had spent 3 years designing procedures for. He had raised his voice at the architect of the operational manual pinned to the bulkhead behind his own head. And she had not said a word about any of it. She had not said a word because she did not need to. The annex said it. The radar said it. The fact that the crew had not run the fast boat intercept drill said it, quietly and without mercy, in a way that would remain on the record whether or not anyone in this room ever spoke of this morning again. Commander Ashworth said, "Petty Officer Reyes, you are relieved of bridge watch. Report to the chief's mess." Reyes said, "Aye, sir." He said it the way you say things when there is nothing to say, when the formula exists, precisely because the formula is all that remains. He picked up nothing. He turned. He walked aft through the bridge and out the hatchway he had been guarding, and into the passageway, and down the ladder well toward the chief's mess, where he would sit at a table under fluorescent light and wait and think and understand with increasing completeness and increasing discomfort exactly what had happened. Admiral Margaret Claire Holt pulled a chair to the surface search radar console without asking for one to be brought to her, because she had not, in 41 years of naval service, waited for a chair to be brought. She sat. She looked at the threat board. She looked at the tracks. She looked at Ferris and at the combat systems officer and at the junior sailors at their stations, and then she opened her carry-on bag, not for anything sentimental, not for a credential or a commendation or a letter of authority, but for a worn yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and she began writing. What she wrote was a condensed version of Section 3 of the Fast Boat Intercept Doctrine, reorganized for verbal delivery. She wrote it the way a person writes when they have written the same material many times and know exactly which parts the students miss and which parts the students think they understand and do not. She wrote quickly and without erasing, in the small, exact handwriting of someone who learned to write in notebooks that had to last a long time. "We're going to run the drill," she said, without looking up. "Not a full exercise cycle. A walkthrough, verbal, at stations. I will narrate the scenario. Your people respond as if it's live." She looked up at Ferris. "How many of your crew have been in contact with a swarm formation?" Ferris said, "Tabletop exercises only, ma'am." She nodded. She had expected that. She had written the requirement for live environment swarm training into the doctrine in 2019. And she had watched it drift to the lower end of training priorities for 4 years before the blockade was reinstated, and she had accepted the invitation from Fifth Fleet to come and see how the doctrine she had written on paper performed in the water, with real ships, real channels, real contacts on a real threat board. She had not expected to spend the first 12 minutes of her visit in a passageway. She did not mention that. She ran the drill. She ran it for 4 hours. She ran it at the table, then at the console, then on her feet, moving from station to station in the flat morning light, while the ship moved through the strait and the real contacts on the real radar changed bearing and distance in real time. She ran it the way she had always trained, without ceremony, without condescension, without the theatrical exasperation of a teacher who wants her students to know she considers their ignorance remarkable. She explained, she demonstrated, she asked questions, she corrected without inflection when corrections were needed. She paused when the radar operator lost track of a contact and walked him through the recovery procedure without making the loss of track into something it was not, which was a moral failure, rather than what it was, which was a pattern that could be learned and corrected. The crew of the USS Russell Watch Section, which had come on watch at 0400 with 9 Iranian fast boats on its threat board and a general quarters alert cycling through the speakers, and the specific, compressed tension of a crew that knows it may be tested before it is ready, discovered, over the course of those 4 hours, that it was being made ready. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and 41 years of understanding exactly what breaks down first when the situation goes past the edge of the training manual and into the space where doctrine either holds or it doesn't. At 0614, the contact geometry changed. At 0614, Combat Information Center reported that the 9 contacts on the threat board had shifted course. They had moved from a dispersed patrol pattern to a convergent intercept geometry, which is the pattern a swarm formation assumes when it transitions from probing to approaching. 9 fast boats, moving toward the transit lane, moving at the speed that requires a decision within 8 minutes. The watch officer looked at the admiral. She was already looking at the board. She said, "Run it." And they ran it. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not recorded in the ship's official after-action report with any level of dramatic specificity, because the after-action report is a document with a function, and that function is not drama. It records what it records, and what it recorded was 9 Iranian fast boat contacts on an intercept course, response package executed per doctrine, contacts altered course and withdrew, no shots fired, no rules of engagement crossed, transit lane held. But the sailors who were on the bridge of the USS Russell at 06:14 on that July morning in the Strait of Hormuz, 26 years old and 22 years old and 31 years old, standing at their stations with their hands on their consoles and their eyes on their screens, running the calls the way the doctrine said to run them, in the sequence the doctrine said to use, on the timing that the drill had, over 4 hours, made into the beginning of something that would become instinct, those sailors would know what happened. They would know because they had run the drill, not a tabletop exercise, not a scenario reconstructed after the fact with all the uncertainty removed. The drill, on the water, with the contacts real, and the geometry real, and the pressure real, and the consequence real, and an admiral in civilian clothes standing at the surface radar console with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and 41 years of knowing exactly what this moment needed. They ran it without confusion. Not without tension. Tension is not the enemy of execution. Tension is what execution happens inside of, if you have trained correctly, if your hands remember what your mind is too busy to think through, if the sequence is in your body because you have run it enough times that your body understands what your mind is still catching up to. They ran it without confusion, and the contacts turned, and the transit lane held, and the blockade held with it. The after-action report would note the contact response as routine. The word routine, in military documentation, carries a specific weight. It means the system worked. It means this is what trained looks like. It means nothing broke, which means everything held, which means the months and years of building and refining and insisting and revising and returning to the question of how you train people to respond correctly, in the 8 minutes before correctly becomes the only option. All of that held. Routine is the highest compliment a system can receive. At 0641, when the contacts had withdrawn and the general quarters cycle had stepped down and the watch section was coming off its highest level of alert, Admiral Holt stood from the console. She gathered her legal pad. She capped her mechanical pencil. She put both back in her carry-on bag. She stood and she looked at the watch crew and she said something that was, in its brevity, more precise than anything she could have said at greater length. She said, "You'll know it next time." That was all. She turned and walked to where Commander Ashworth was standing. He said, quietly, "Admiral, is there anything further you need?" She said, "I'll see myself out. Thank you for the watch time." She picked up her carry-on bag. She walked across the bridge. She went through the hatchway. She went down the passageway, down the ladder well, through the watertight doors, back to the quarterdeck, and off the ship. Seaman Collier, who happened to be recrossing the quarterdeck at that moment, held the lifeline for her as she stepped to the brow. She thanked him without stopping. She walked down to the pier and into the July heat of the base and did not look back. The conversation between Commander Ashworth and Petty Officer Second Class Daniel Reyes happened in the XO's office at 07:15. It was not a long conversation. It did not need to be. The facts of the morning were sufficiently complete on their own. Ashworth laid them out with the clinical precision of a man who takes no pleasure in this kind of accounting, who finds it neither gratifying nor painful, but simply necessary, the way surgery is necessary, the way the truth is necessary, when avoiding it would make everything worse. He said, a retired vice admiral, recalled to observe the live application of doctrine she had personally authored, had been physically restrained by a petty officer acting under a misapplication of standing orders. He said, the specific standing order in question applied to unsupervised civilian observers and was never intended to apply to flag rank personnel traveling in civilian attire under recall orders. He said, this distinction was available to anyone who read the standing order in its complete form, including the paragraph Reyes had not read because he had been told the summary. He said, Admiral Holt had submitted no formal complaint. She had requested no disciplinary proceeding. She had asked, in fact, that the entire incident be excluded from the after-action report, and that request had been honored. He said, none of that changes what Reyes did. None of it unrings the bell. None of it makes the arm grab something other than what it was, or makes the raised voice something other than what it was, or makes the presumption something other than what it was. He said, Reyes was being reassigned to a non-bridge watch duty section for the remainder of the deployment, while a formal review of his watch-standing qualification was conducted. The review was not a certainty of loss. It was a review. The outcome of that review would be determined by factors beyond this morning, would weigh his record and his performance and his potential against the nature of this error, and would arrive at whatever conclusion the record warranted. He said, the Navy does not expect its people to be infallible. It expects them to be trainable. It expects them to learn from this kind of error in a way that makes them, over the course of a career, the kind of person who does not make it again. The question the review would answer was whether Reyes was that kind of person. Reyes sat across the table from Commander Ashworth in the XO's office and said nothing that was untrue. He did not explain himself in ways that were not accurate. He did not diminish the morning or argue with the accounting of it. He said, yes, sir, where yes, sir was the correct answer, and he said nothing where nothing was the correct answer, and he left the XO's office at 0741 and walked aft and went about the duties he had been assigned for the day, and he thought about the morning, and he continued to think about it. He thought about the woman standing in the corridor with the carry-on bag and the gray-blue eyes. He thought about the way she had waited. Not angry, not performing patience, not doing anything with her waiting except waiting, because she knew what was coming and was allowing it to arrive. He thought about the name on the annex. He thought about the way Ashworth's voice had changed when he said, Admiral. He thought about the 4 hours on the bridge, and the drill, and the contacts turning, and the word routine in a document that didn't know what routine cost. He thought about the fact that she had asked, from the beginning, only one question. Not who is your commanding officer, not do you know who I am, not do you understand what you're doing. One question. Is your executive officer on the bridge? She had known the answer. She had known how long it would take. She had set down her bag and waited, and let time do what time does when you know how to use it. And she had been right. And it had been 47 seconds. And in those 47 seconds, she had not done a single thing except wait with the absolute stillness of a person who has nothing to prove to anyone standing in that corridor. He thought about that stillness for a long time. He would think about it, in some form or another, for the rest of his career. The story moved through the Russell the way stories move through ships. Not quickly. Ships are not places where things spread with the viral velocity of a connected world. They are enclosed spaces, with specific hierarchies and specific cultures, and the things that move through them move along those channels, from chief to junior sailor, from wardroom to mess deck, in the deliberate and somewhat compressed manner of people who are spending a great deal of time in close proximity and know that the stories they tell will be heard many times by the same people and need to be worth hearing. By the end of the first watch after the incident, the chiefs aboard the Russell knew what had happened. Not every detail, not the classified details, but the shape of it. A petty officer and a retired flag officer, and a hatchway and a corridor, and a name on a board. The shape was sufficient. The shape contained everything that needed to be transmitted. By the end of the second day, the junior sailors knew. Not loudly, not as gossip exactly, as instruction. As the specific kind of story that ships pass to their people when they need their people to understand something that cannot be communicated through a training manual or a standing order or a two-paragraph brief delivered at the beginning of watch. The kind of story that is, in fact, the oldest form of instruction that any organization has ever used, because it works. Because a story about a real hatchway on a real ship with a real woman and a real name on a real board is a different kind of knowledge from a principle stated in the abstract. It stays. What stayed, aboard the Russell, was this. You do not know who is standing in front of you. You think you do. You think the uniform tells you, or the rank insignia, or the age, or the build, or the gender, or the carry-on bag in civilian clothes in a passageway of a warship. You think those things are data. They are. But they are incomplete data. They are the outside of the thing, and the outside of the thing is not the thing. The thing is 41 years. The thing is a doctrine written in 2019 that is currently pinned to the bulkhead 2 feet behind your left shoulder. The thing is the name in the upper right corner of the classified annex. The thing is 4 hours on a bridge in July in the Strait, with 9 contacts on the threat board, and a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and a crew that ran the drill correctly when the contacts turned at 06:14, because she had spent the morning making them ready, instead of the morning that she had planned to spend, which was observing. And the count is still rising. And the count is still rising. And the count is still rising. And when she left, she asked only that her name stay off the after-action report. Not credit, not acknowledgement, not a formal record of the 4 hours, or the 9 contacts, or the transit lane, or the word routine that appeared in the document that the review board would eventually read without knowing what it represented. Her name stays off the report. The report says, response package executed per doctrine, contacts withdrew, transit lane held. That is all. It is enough. It is, in fact, exactly enough, because the doctrine is sufficient, and the drill worked, and the crew is more ready than they were, and the lane held, and none of the rest of it requires a name on a document to be true. The truth of it is in the outcome, which is the only place the truth of competence ever finally lives. This is the part of the story that the chiefs pass to the junior sailors when they pass it. Not the part about the corridor, though they pass that part too. The part about the after-action report. The part about what she asked for, and what she did not ask for. Because that part is the part that contains the lesson, and the lesson is the reason the story exists. The lesson is not, be polite to strangers because they might outrank you. That lesson is true, but it is small. It fits inside a standing order. It does not require a story. The lesson is, the most capable person in any room is frequently the person who most looks like they don't need to be there. They look that way because they have stopped needing to perform capability for an audience. They crossed that bridge long ago, and they have been moving away from it ever since. And where they have arrived is this: a corridor, a carry-on bag, 7 words in response to a voice raised at them, and 47 seconds of stillness, so complete it filled the whole passageway. And 4 hours on a bridge, and a crew that knew what to do when the contacts turned, and a name nowhere on the record, and the lane held. Petty Officer Second Class Daniel Reyes, reassigned from Bridge Watch for the remainder of that deployment, completed his review and returned to watch standing qualification 7 weeks later. He served on 3 subsequent deployments. He made Chief Petty Officer at the earliest eligible mark. He became, in the opinion of his commanding officers across those years, one of the better watch supervisors the surface community produced in that decade. Patient, thorough, the kind of chief who reads the complete version of a standing order before he briefs the summary, who knows that the summary is a door into the document and the document is the thing you actually need to know. He never talked about the morning in the Strait of Hormuz in any formal context. He talked about it once, that he ever talked about it at all, to a seaman first class on his watch section, a young woman who had made an assumption about someone on the pier and had been wrong about it in a small way that had cost her nothing and taught her something, and who was embarrassed about it. He told her a story about a corridor and a carry-on bag. He told it briefly. He did not name anyone. He described the 47 seconds of stillness the way you describe something that changed how you see a thing, not dramatically, not with the architecture of a lesson, just as something that happened and is worth knowing. He said she waited. She already knew how it was going to go. She set down her bag and she waited. And she was right, and it was 47 seconds. And in those 47 seconds, she didn't say a single word, and she didn't need to. The seaman first class said, "Who was she?" He said, "Someone who'd had a long time to get very good at something, and who didn't need anyone else in that corridor to know it." The seaman first class thought about that for a while. Then she went back to her station and did her work. That is how the story traveled. Not as a reprimand, not as a cautionary tale pasted on a bulkhead. As a story passed from one person to another, in the ordinary spaces where people talk to each other about things that matter, where the things that are true enough to survive, survive, and where the things that are too complicated for a standing order, but too important to be lost, become what they have always become in the places where people do difficult things under pressure and need to know how to be ready for them. They become instruction. They become the thing you tell someone when you want them to understand. Not just the rule, but the reason behind the rule. And behind the reason, the reality that made the rule necessary. And behind the reality, the specific human fact of it. The corridor, the bag, the 47 seconds, the name on the board. They become the story that stays. Admiral Margaret Claire Holt filed her observation report to Fifth Fleet in August. It was thorough and specific and classified and noted in the section on training readiness that the crew of the USS Russell had demonstrated adequate familiarity with the fast boat intercept doctrine and had responded appropriately to a real-time swarm contact formation during the period of observation. She noted recommended improvements to the training cycle. She noted specific timing issues in the handoff between Combat Information Center and the bridge during contact escalation, and she described a modification to the communication protocol that would address those issues. She noted nothing about the corridor. She noted nothing about the 47 seconds. She noted nothing about the name on the board, or the hand on her arm, or the voice raised at her in the passageway of a warship, where every surface carried, in one way or another, evidence of the work she had put into the system that was holding. The report went up the chain. The recommendations were reviewed and incorporated into the next revision of the doctrine, which took effect 6 months later, which was read by watch officers and bridge crews across the fleet, which was, in that revision, slightly more precise about the communication protocol, slightly more specific about timing, slightly better than it had been, in the way that things are made better when the people who know them most closely keep returning to the work. That is the only record of that morning that carries her name. A training revision, a note in an annex, a doctrine, better than it was. The lane holds. That is enough. For more stories where quiet competence humbles loud arrogance, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. These are the stories of the ones who built the systems that held, who wrote the doctrine that worked, who showed up in the corridor with a carry-on bag and 41 years and asked nothing except that the drill be run. And if you'd like to help me keep telling them, you'll find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.